Some betrayals cut deeper than others. When the person you love reveals a cruel heart towards someone who raised you, everything you thought you knew crumbles in an instant. Elijah Royce built his fortune from nothing, becoming one of the most successful real estate moguls on the East Coast. At 58, he thought he'd found the perfect partner in Catherine, a sophisticated woman 30 years his junior. But when he brings her to his childhood home in Virginia to meet Rosa, the devoted maid who helped raise him, everything changes. In one devastating moment, Elijah witnesses Catherine's true nature as she humiliates the woman who sacrificed everything for his family. What happens when a man must choose between the woman he loves and the woman who loved him first? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Elijah Royce's corner office on the 30th floor of the Royce building in downtown Richmond. From his mahogany desk, he could see the James River winding its way through the city he'd helped reshape over the past 3 decades. At 58, Elijah carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned everything he possessed. His silver-touched beard was meticulously groomed, his dark suit impeccably tailored, yet there remained something humble in his bearing, a reminder of the boy who had started with nothing. The Royce Development Group controlled more commercial and residential properties along the eastern seaboard than any other minority-owned firm. Elijah's name appeared on hospital wings, scholarship funds, and community centers throughout Virginia. Yet for all his public success, he treasured most the quiet moments of reflection, the times when he could remember the hands that had shaped him long before the world knew his name. Catherine Mitchell entered his thoughts, as she often did these days, bringing with her a mixture of excitement and uncertainty that he hadn't felt since his 20s. At 28, she possessed the kind of polished beauty that turned heads in every room she entered. Her auburn hair caught light like spun gold, and her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and ambition. She had graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown, with degrees in art history and international business, spoke 3 languages fluently, and moved through high society with effortless grace. They had met at a charity gala 18 months ago, where Catherine was representing a prestigious auction house, specializing in African-American art and artifacts. Elijah had been immediately drawn to her knowledge and passion for preserving cultural heritage. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of gallery openings, wine tastings, and intimate dinners at the finest establishments in Richmond, Washington, and New York. 6 months ago, he had proposed during a weekend in Martha's Vineyard, presenting her with his grandmother's diamond ring, a modest but beautiful piece that had belonged to the woman who had raised his father after his great-grandmother died in childbirth. Catherine had accepted with tears of joy, though Elijah sometimes caught her studying the ring with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Now, as their wedding approached, Elijah felt it was time to introduce Catherine to the most important person in his life, aside from her, Rosa Martinez, the woman who had been more than a housekeeper to the Royce family for over 4 decades. The ancestral Royce estate sat on 200 acres of rolling hills outside Charlottesville, a property that had been in his family since his great-grandfather purchased it in 1924, with money saved from his work as a Pullman porter. The main house, built in the colonial revival style, featured red brick facade, white columns, and dormered windows that overlooked formal gardens Rosa had maintained with loving care for nearly half her life. Elijah's father, Samuel Royce, had been one of the first black engineers hired by the Virginia Department of Transportation, and his mother, Grace, had taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school for 37 years. They had been pillars of their community, known for their generosity, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to education and civil rights. When they died in a car accident during Elijah's junior year at Howard University, the loss had nearly destroyed him. Rosa had been the one to call him that terrible night, her voice steady despite her own grief. She had been the one to arrange the funeral, handle the estate details, and somehow hold everything together while Elijah struggled to process a world without his parents. More than that, she had been the one to encourage him to finish his degree, to pursue his dreams, to honor his parents' memory by building something meaningful with his life. "Mijo," she had said to him during those dark months, using the Spanish endearment she had called him since childhood. "Your parents planted seeds in you. Don't let their death stop those seeds from growing." Rosa had come to work for the Royce family when Elijah was 8 years old, a young widow from El Salvador who spoke broken English but possessed an inexhaustible capacity for love and hard work. She had her own small apartment above the garage, but in practical terms, she lived and breathed for the Royce family. She cooked their meals, maintained their home, tended their garden, and somehow managed to be present for every important moment of Elijah's life: school plays, basketball games, graduation ceremonies, and eventually, business victories. Her handwritten recipe book, a thick notebook bound in cracked leather and filled with decades of culinary wisdom, sat in the kitchen like a family heirloom. The pages, stained with flour and sauce, yellowed with age, contained not just recipes, but memories. "Elijah's favorite birthday cake, extra vanilla," read one entry in her careful script. "Grace's Christmas tamales, make extra for church potluck," noted another. Each recipe told the story of their family, marking celebrations, comforting sorrows, and feeding not just bodies, but souls. Rosa had never married again, though Elijah knew she had received several proposals over the years. When he asked her once why she remained single, she had smiled and said, "God gave me a family to love. Why would I need anything more?" Now at 63, Rosa moved a bit slower than she once had. Her dark hair was threaded with silver, and her hands showed the wear of decades of service. But her eyes remained bright with intelligence and affection, and her laugh could still fill the entire house with warmth. Catherine had never met Rosa, though Elijah had spoken of her often. He had wanted to bring Catherine to the estate several times, but their busy schedules and her frequent travels for work had always seemed to interfere. Catherine had listened politely to his stories about Rosa, nodding and smiling in appropriate places. But Elijah sometimes sensed a distance in her responses, as if she couldn't quite understand why he spoke of a housekeeper with such reverence. "She sounds lovely," Catherine would say. "I'm sure we'll get along wonderfully." But Elijah had begun to notice certain patterns in Catherine's behavior that gave him pause. The way she spoke to waiters and service staff, while not outright rude, carried an undertone of entitlement that made him uncomfortable. Her tendency to criticize the help at various venues they visited, her assumption that certain people existed primarily to serve her needs, her casual dismissal of anyone she deemed beneath her social station. He had attributed these moments to stress, to the pressures of her demanding career, to the natural adjustment period of their relationship. Catherine came from a wealthy Connecticut family, had attended private schools, and moved in circles where such attitudes were unfortunately common. Elijah told himself that exposure to Rosa's warmth and wisdom would help Catherine understand that dignity and worth had nothing to do with social status or job titles. The estate represented more than just property to Elijah. It was the physical embodiment of his family's dreams, struggles and triumphs. Every room held memories, every photograph on the mantel told a story. Every piece of furniture had been chosen with care and saved for with sacrifice. He wanted Catherine to understand this history, to see how Rosa fit into the tapestry of his life, to appreciate the woman who had helped shape the man Catherine claimed to love. As Elijah prepared to leave his office that Friday afternoon, his phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Can't wait for our romantic weekend at your family estate. Just the two of us at last." He smiled as he read her message, then typed back, "Actually, Rosa will be there too. I'm excited for you two to finally meet." The response took longer than usual. "Oh, I thought she had weekends off." "She does, but she lives there." It's her home too. Another pause. Of course. See you tonight? Something in the brevity of her responses troubled him, but Elijah pushed the concern aside. Catherine was probably just tired from her latest business trip. Once she met Rosa, once she experienced the warmth and love that permeated every corner of the estate, she would understand why this place and this woman meant so much to him. As Elijah drove out of the city toward the rolling hills of his childhood, he thought about the future he was trying to build, one that honored his past while embracing new possibilities. He wanted Catherine to become part of the fabric of his family's story, to add her own thread to the rich tapestry that Rosa had helped weave over the decades. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the familiar landscape as he turned onto the gravel drive that led home. Rosa's garden was in full bloom, a riot of colors and fragrances that welcomed him like an embrace. Through the kitchen window, he could see her moving about, preparing dinner with the same careful attention she had given to every meal she had ever cooked for his family. Soon, Catherine would be here. Soon, the two most important women in his life would meet. Elijah allowed himself to hope that this weekend would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one where love, respect, and family tradition could all exist in perfect harmony. Catherine arrived at the estate just as the sun was setting, her silver BMW convertible crunching across the gravel drive with precision. Elijah watched from the front porch as she stepped out, looking effortlessly elegant in white linen pants and a flowing blouse. Her designer handbag, a limited edition piece from Milan that had cost more than many people earned in 3 months, hanging perfectly from her shoulder. The bag, crafted from buttery soft leather and adorned with gold hardware, seemed to gleam in the fading light, a symbol of the rarefied world she inhabited. "This place is even more beautiful than I imagined," Catherine said as she kissed him hello, her eyes sweeping across the estate's manicured grounds. "It's so authentic." There was something in the way she said that last word that made Elijah pause. But before he could analyze it further, Rosa appeared at the front door, wiping her hands on her apron and beaming with the warm smile that had greeted him countless times throughout his life. "Mijo, you're home," Rosa said, embracing Elijah with the fierce affection of a mother welcoming her son. "And this must be Catherine." "Welcome to our home, mija." Catherine stepped forward with a polished smile, extending her hand for a handshake rather than accepting Rosa's obvious invitation for an embrace. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Rosa. Elijah has told me so much about you." "Come, come," Rosa said, either not noticing or choosing to ignore the coolness in Catherine's greeting. "Dinner is almost ready. I made your favorite, Elijah, my grandmother's recipe for ropa vieja with black beans and rice. And for you, Catherine, I wasn't sure what you liked. So I also prepared some grilled fish with herbs from my garden." As they moved toward the dining room, Elijah felt a surge of pride watching Rosa showcase the feast she had prepared. The table was set with his mother's good china. Candles flickered softly, and the aroma of Rosa's cooking filled the air with warmth and comfort. This was what he wanted Catherine to experience, the love that transformed a house into a home. "Everything smells delicious," Catherine said, though Elijah noticed she barely touched the traditional Cuban dishes, focusing instead on the fish and picking at small portions. "You must have been cooking all day." "It's my pleasure," Rosa replied, bustling around the table, refilling glasses and adjusting serving dishes. "Cooking for family is never work." Catherine's smile flickered almost imperceptibly at the word family, but she recovered quickly. The conversation during dinner remained polite, if somewhat strained. Catherine spoke about her recent trip to authenticate a collection of Harlem Renaissance paintings, while Rosa listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about the artists and their stories. After dinner, as Rosa began clearing the dishes, Catherine finally relaxed, settling back in her chair with a glass of wine. "Leave them, Rosa," she said with a dismissive wave. "They can wait until morning." "Oh no, mija," Rosa replied gently. "I always clean as I go. It keeps the kitchen nice for breakfast." "Really?" Just leave them, Catherine repeated, her tone carrying more authority this time. Elijah and I have had a long week. We'd like to relax. Elijah felt something cold settle in his stomach as he watched the exchange. Rosa, if you want to leave them— No, Rosa said quickly, already gathering plates. It only takes a few minutes. The next morning, Elijah woke to the sound of Catherine's voice rising from the kitchen below. At first, he thought she might be on a business call, but as he listened more carefully, he realized she was speaking to someone in the house. He pulled on a robe and made his way downstairs, following the sound of her voice. What he heard made his blood run cold. Completely unacceptable. I specifically asked for my coffee with almond milk, not regular milk. Do you not understand English? Rosa's voice was barely audible in response. I'm sorry, Miss Catherine. I thought you said regular milk. I can make fresh— This is exactly the kind of carelessness I was talking about. And why is this kitchen such a mess? Crumbs everywhere, coffee grounds on the counter. If you're going to work in someone's home, you need to maintain basic standards of cleanliness. Elijah stepped into the kitchen to find Catherine standing with her hands on her hips, her designer handbag placed prominently on the counter as if staking territorial claim, while Rosa stood at the sink with her back turned, her shoulders rigid with barely contained emotion. The kitchen was, as always, immaculate except for the normal signs of breakfast preparation. And another thing, Catherine continued, her voice gaining momentum. I noticed you didn't change the sheets in the guest bathroom yesterday. When you have people visiting, you need to anticipate their needs without being asked. It's basic housekeeping. Catherine, Elijah said sharply, causing both women to turn toward him. Catherine's face immediately brightened with innocence, while Rosa's eyes showed a mixture of hurt and embarrassment that cut through him like a blade. Oh, good morning, darling, Catherine said, moving to kiss his cheek. I was just explaining to Rosa how we might improve the service level here. Nothing major, just some basic standards. Rosa, Elijah said gently, could you give us a moment, please? Rosa nodded without speaking and walked past them toward the pantry, her dignity intact, but her pain visible in the way she held herself. The moment she was out of earshot, Elijah turned to face Catherine with an expression she had never seen before. What the hell was that? He asked quietly. Catherine's eyebrows rose in surprise. What do you mean? I was just providing some constructive feedback. The service here is— Rosa is not the service, Elijah interrupted, his voice still low but carrying unmistakable steel. She is family. She has been part of this family longer than you've been alive. Elijah, I think you're overreacting, Catherine said, her tone becoming placating. I wasn't mean to her. I was just being clear about expectations. You can't let help get comfortable or they'll take advantage. The word help hit Elijah like a physical blow. Help, Catherine, that woman raised me. She held this family together when my parents died. She has given her entire adult life to caring for people she loves, and you're treating her like hired staff. Well, technically, isn't she? Catherine's voice was getting sharper now, her careful veneer beginning to crack. I mean, you pay her, don't you? This is her job. This is her home, Elijah said firmly. She doesn't work for me, Catherine. She's part of my family. Catherine stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her calculating, trying to determine the best approach to diffuse the situation. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more conciliatory. You're right, of course. I'm sorry. I think I'm just tired from the drive, and you know how I get when I don't have my morning coffee exactly right. It makes me cranky. She moved closer to him, placing her hand on his chest. I'll apologize to Rosa. I didn't mean to hurt her feelings. But Elijah could see past the apology to something harder underneath, something that viewed Rosa not as a person deserving of respect, but as an obstacle to be managed. The way Catherine's eyes had lit with disdain when she spoke about help getting comfortable, the casual cruelty in her voice when she thought he wasn't. Listening, these weren't the actions of someone who was simply tired or having a bad morning. I think you should, he said quietly. And I think you should mean it. Catherine's smile became slightly strained. Of course I'll mean it. But as she walked toward the pantry to find Rosa, adjusting her designer handbag on her shoulder like armor, Elijah felt something fundamental shift between them. For the first time since he had known her, he found himself questioning not just Catherine's behavior, but her character. From the pantry came the sound of Catherine's voice, bright and apologetic. "Rosa, I'm so sorry about earlier. I haven't had my coffee yet. And you know how impossible I can be before caffeine." Rosa's response was gracious, as Elijah knew it would be, accepting the apology with the kind of dignity that had carried her through decades of life's challenges. But when she emerged from the pantry a few minutes later, after Catherine had gone upstairs to shower, her eyes met Elijah's with a look that said everything her words could not. She had seen something in Catherine that worried her deeply. And now, so had he. Elijah lay awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom, while Catherine slept peacefully beside him. In the darkness, he found himself running his fingers over his father's pocket watch, which he kept on the nightstand, a habit he had developed during times of uncertainty. The gold case was worn smooth from decades of handling, first by his father and grandfather before him, and now by Elijah when he needed to feel connected to the moral foundation they had instilled in him. Samuel Royce had carried that watch every day of his working life, a wedding gift from Grace that he treasured not for its modest value, but for what it represented. Time spent in service to family, community, and principles that mattered more than material success. "Time is the only currency that matters, son," his father had told him once. "How you spend it defines who you are." As Elijah held the watch now, he wondered how his father would have reacted to what he had witnessed in the kitchen. Samuel Royce had been a man who treated everyone with equal dignity, from the governor who occasionally sought his engineering expertise to the janitor who cleaned his office building. He would have been appalled by Catherine's behavior, and more importantly, he would have been disappointed in Elijah for allowing it to happen under his roof. The memory of Rosa's face haunted him, the way her shoulders had tensed when Catherine spoke to her with such casual contempt, the quiet dignity with which she had absorbed the insults, the look in her eyes when she realized that Elijah had witnessed her humiliation. In that moment, he had seen a flash of something he rarely observed in Rosa, vulnerability. His mind drifted back to the countless ways Rosa had shaped his life, moments he had perhaps taken for granted until now. When he was 12 and struggling with math, Rosa had sat with him at the kitchen table every evening, patiently working through problems, despite her own limited formal education. "We figure it out together, mijo," she would say. That's what family does. When he was 15 and heartbroken over his first girlfriend, Rosa had made his favorite meal and listened to him pour out his adolescent pain without judgment or advice, just presence and understanding. When he was 17 and terrified about leaving for college, she had spent weeks helping him prepare, washing and folding his clothes with extra care, packing homemade cookies for his dormitory room, and slipping notes of encouragement into his textbooks that he would discover throughout his freshman year. During his parents' funeral, when Elijah had been too devastated to function, Rosa had somehow managed her own grief while handling every detail, contacting relatives, coordinating with the church, preparing food for the dozens of people who came to pay their respects. She had been the steady presence that held everything together when his world was falling apart, and when he had started his first business, a small property management company operating out of a converted garage. Rosa had been his unofficial accountant, secretary, and moral support. She had answered phones in her careful English, maintained his files with meticulous organization, and celebrated every small victory as if it were her own triumph. "Your success is my success," she had told him when his company finally turned a profit after 2 difficult years. "Because you are my heart, mijo." Now, lying in the darkness, Elijah forced himself to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had been noticing troubling patterns in Catherine's behavior for months, but had rationalized them away because he was infatuated with her beauty, intelligence, and social status. There was the evening at a charity fundraiser when she had snapped at a young server who accidentally spilled water near her chair, calling the girl clumsy, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Catherine had later claimed she was just having a stressful day at work. There was the afternoon when they visited his barbershop in Jackson Ward, a neighborhood institution where Elijah had been getting his hair cut since childhood. Catherine had sat stiffly in the waiting area, looking around with barely concealed distaste, later commenting that she didn't understand why he couldn't find a more upscale salon for his grooming needs. There was the dinner party at his business partner's home, where Catherine had spoken over and around the host's wife, a school teacher, as if she weren't present, focusing all her attention on the men in the room who she deemed worthy of her charm. And there were the subtle comments about Rosa herself, observations Catherine had made during their conversations that Elijah now realized revealed her true feelings. "It must be nice to have someone so devoted," she had said once, but with an undertone that suggested she found such devotion somehow pathetic rather than admirable. When Elijah had mentioned that he was considering gifting Rosa a small cottage on the estate property for her retirement, Catherine had frowned and asked, "Don't you think that might create uncomfortable precedents with employees?" "She's not an employee," Elijah had corrected firmly. "Of course not," Catherine had quickly backtracked. "I just meant from a legal perspective." But he was beginning to understand that Catherine's perspective on Rosa, and perhaps on anyone she considered beneath her social station, was fundamentally different from his own. To Catherine, Rosa was the help, someone whose feelings and dignity were secondary to her own comfort and convenience. The next morning, Elijah woke to find Catherine already dressed and pacing the bedroom, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke in rapid, urgent tones to someone about a client emergency. When she hung up, she turned to him with an expression of practiced regret. "Darling, I'm so sorry, but I have to cut our weekend short. There's a crisis with the Morrison Collection authentication, and I need to get back to New York immediately." Part of Elijah felt relieved. It would give him time to process what had happened and figure out how to address it. But another part of him recognized this for what it was. Catherine's way of avoiding a difficult conversation about her behavior. "We should talk about yesterday," he said quietly. "There's nothing to talk about," Catherine replied briskly, checking her appearance in the mirror. "I apologized to Rosa. She accepted it graciously, and we've all moved on. Sometimes people have bad moments, Elijah. It doesn't define who they are." But as she gathered her things, including the designer handbag that now seemed to represent everything about her that troubled him, Elijah could see that she hadn't truly understood the gravity of what had occurred. In her mind, she had handled a minor staff issue and resolved it with a simple apology. She couldn't grasp that she had wounded someone Elijah loved, someone who deserved his protection and respect. "I'll call you when I get to the city," Catherine said, kissing him goodbye with the same polished affection she always displayed. "Don't let this silly misunderstanding spoil our plans, darling. Rosa seems perfectly fine now." After Catherine left, Elijah found Rosa in the garden, tending to her tomatoes with the same careful attention she brought to everything she did. She looked up as he approached, her smile warm, but not quite reaching her eyes. "She seems like a lovely girl," Rosa said diplomatically. "Very sophisticated, Rosa," Elijah began, but she held up a soil-stained hand to stop him. "Micho, you don't need to say anything. Sometimes it takes time for people to understand each other. She comes from a different world than we do." The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither wanted to speak aloud. Different worlds, indeed, one where people like Rosa were valued for their humanity, and another where they were tolerated for their utility. As Elijah helped Rosa stake the tomato plants, he fingered his father's watch in his pocket and wondered what he was supposed to do with the growing certainty that the woman he had planned to marry was not the person he had believed her to be. 3 weeks passed before Catherine returned to the estate, and during that time, Elijah found himself having conversations he had never expected to have. The first came during his weekly lunch with Marcus Webb. his longtime business partner and closest friend, at their usual spot downtown. "You've been different lately," Marcus observed, cutting into his steak with the directness that had made him such an effective negotiator. Distracted. "What's going on?" Elijah had known Marcus since college. They had pledged the same fraternity, built their businesses together, and served as best men at each other's weddings. If anyone would understand the complexity of his situation, it would be Marcus. "It's Catherine," Elijah admitted. "Something happened when I brought her to meet Rosa." As he recounted the kitchen incident, Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Elijah finished, Marcus set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "Man, I've been wondering when you were going to see it," Marcus said quietly. "See what?" "The way she looks at people. I noticed it at the hospital fundraiser last month. She was charming as hell with the board members and major donors, but I watched her interact with the catering staff. There was this, I don't know how to describe it, this dismissiveness, like they were furniture." Elijah felt his stomach drop. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you were happy, and I hoped I was wrong. But brother, the way someone treats people who can't do anything for them, that tells you everything about their character." That same week, Elijah had lunch with Dr. Patricia Williams, a family friend who had been his mother's closest colleague and confidant. Patricia had known Rosa almost as long as the family had, and when Elijah mentioned Catherine's behavior, her response was immediate and uncompromising. "That child has shown you who she is," Patricia said firmly. "Believe her. Rosa has been like a mother to you since Grace passed. Anyone who would treat her with such disrespect—" She shook her head. "Elijah, honey, you can't build a marriage on a foundation of disrespect." But it was his conversation with Rosa herself that affected him most deeply. He found her in his father's study one evening, carefully organizing papers that had been stored there since his parents' death. Among the documents was the original deed to the estate, and Rosa was handling it with the reverence she showed to all family artifacts. "I've been thinking, mijo," she said without looking up from the papers. "Maybe it's time for me to retire, move to a little apartment in town, give you and Catherine space to build your life together." The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. "Rosa, no. This is your home. I know you care about me," she said gently, finally meeting his eyes. "But I can see how things are. Catherine will be your wife soon, and she should feel comfortable in her own home. I don't want to be the cause of problems between you." Elijah knelt beside her chair, taking her weathered hands in his. "You are not the problem, Rosa. You could never be the problem. But I am in the way," she said with sad wisdom. "Some people, they don't understand our kind of family. They think love should look a certain way, come from certain places. I don't want you to have to choose. If someone makes me choose between them and you," Elijah said firmly, "they've already lost." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if he truly meant them. The legal deed Rosa held represented more than property ownership. It was a symbol of belonging, of home, of family legacy. Rosa's name wasn't on that document, but her heart and soul were embedded in every inch of the estate. Could he really end his engagement over this? Was he being unreasonable to expect Catherine to embrace Rosa as family? When Catherine finally returned for another weekend visit, she brought reinforcements, two of her closest friends from New York. Sophisticated women named Vivienne and Margot, who moved through the estate like anthropologists studying an interesting but primitive culture. "It's so authentic," Vivienne gushed as they toured the house. "Like stepping back in time. You could totally turn this into the most amazing bed and breakfast." "The bones are good," Margot agreed, running her finger along the mantelpiece in a way that made Rosa's careful housekeeping seem inadequate. "Though you'd want to modernize everything, of course. And that garden is charming in a rustic way." Elijah watched Catherine during these exchanges, noting how she seemed to distance herself from the estate's history when viewed through her friend's eyes. She didn't mention that the garden was Rosa's pride and joy, didn't explain the significance of the family photographs, didn't share any of the stories Elijah had told her about his childhood here. At dinner, Prepared by Rosa with her usual care and attention, the three women dominated the conversation with talk of gallery openings, society parties, and mutual acquaintances. Rosa served each course with quiet dignity, but Elijah could see how the women's casual indifference affected her. "This food is so interesting," Margot commented, prodding at Rosa's perfectly prepared arroz con pollo. "Very ethnic. Did you find the recipe online?" "My grandmother taught it to me in El Salvador," Rosa replied politely. "How exotic," Vivian said with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. "Catherine, you're so adventurous, embracing all these different cultural experiences." The way they spoke about Rosa's heritage, her cooking, her very presence in the house, made Elijah's blood simmer. They treated her culture like a curiosity, her food like an anthropological specimen, her service like an expected convenience. After dinner, as Rosa cleared the dishes, Catherine made a show of helping, something she had never done before, clearly performing for her friends rather than acting from genuine consideration. "You're so good with the help," Vivian observed. "I can never get mine to cook anything this elaborate." "It's all about setting clear expectations," Catherine replied, loading dishes into Rosa's arms rather than into the dishwasher. "You have to be firm but fair." That night, after Catherine's friends had retired to the guest rooms, Elijah confronted her about their behavior. "They were condescending to Rosa all evening," he said, as they prepared for bed. "They were being polite," Catherine protested. "Maybe a little chatty, but that's just their way. Calling her culture exotic and treating her like hired entertainment isn't polite." "Catherine, you're being oversensitive," she said, her voice taking on an edge. "Vivian and Margot come from old families. They're used to a certain level of formality with household staff." "Household staff," Elijah repeated slowly. "Is that what you think Rosa is?" Catherine's mask slipped slightly, revealing the frustration underneath. "What do you want me to call her, Elijah? She works in your house, she cleans, she cooks. I'm trying to be respectful, but let's not pretend this is something it's not. What do you think this is?" "A business arrangement," Catherine said finally. "A very generous one, clearly, given how comfortable she's become here. But ultimately, you pay her to take care of your home, and she does. That's not family, Elijah. That's employment." The words hung between them like a chasm that Elijah suddenly realized might be too wide to bridge. Catherine saw Rosa's decades of love, sacrifice, and devotion as nothing more than a job well done. She couldn't understand that some bonds transcend contracts, that some relationships are built on choice rather than obligation. "I think your friends should leave tomorrow," he said quietly. "They just got here," Catherine protested. "We planned a whole weekend, and I think you should consider whether this is really what you want," Elijah continued. "Because Rosa isn't going anywhere, Catherine. This is her home. If you can't accept that, if you can't treat her with the respect she deserves, then maybe we need to reconsider what we're doing here." Catherine stared at him with an expression he had never seen before. Cold, calculation mixed with genuine surprise that he would choose Rosa over her. "Comfort, you're actually serious about this," she said slowly. "Completely serious. We're talking about our future together, Elijah, our marriage. And you're willing to jeopardize that over a disagreement about household management." The fact that she still framed it as household management told Elijah everything he needed to know about how far apart they really were. "I'm willing to defend the people I love," he said simply. "I thought you understood that about me." As Catherine turned away from him, Elijah could feel something breaking between them, something that might have been irreparable from the moment she first spoke to Rosa with contempt. Rosa's worn leather Bible sat on her bedside table like an old friend, its pages yellowed with age and marked with decades of prayers, hopes, and quiet meditations. Between the book of Psalms and Proverbs, she had tucked family photographs, pressed flowers from Grace Royce's funeral, and handwritten notes documenting the important moments of the family she had chosen to serve. Birth dates, graduation ceremonies, business milestones, all carefully recorded in her precise handwriting as if she were the keeper of their collective memory. That evening, After Catherine's friends had finally departed following a tense and abbreviated visit, Rosa opened her Bible to seek the comfort she had always found in its familiar verses. But tonight the comfort was elusive. At 63, she had survived civil war in El Salvador, the death of her young husband, immigration to a foreign country, and decades of quiet discrimination. Yet nothing had prepared her for the possibility that her place in the Royce family might be coming to an end. She had come to Virginia in 1983, a 22-year-old widow, fleeing violence that had claimed her husband and destroyed her village. The Royce family had taken a chance on her, despite her limited English and lack of American work experience, seeing something in her eyes that spoke of resilience and integrity. Grace Royce, in particular, had recognized a kindred spirit, another woman who understood that love was often expressed through service, that dignity came from how you treated others rather than how they treated you. Over the years, Rosa had sent money back to El Salvador to support her elderly mother and younger siblings, living on a fraction of her modest salary, while investing the rest in the education and futures of family members she might never see again. She had never asked the Royces for more than they offered, never complained about long hours or difficult tasks, never expected anything beyond fair treatment and the privilege of being part of something larger than herself. When Grace and Samuel died, Rosa had been the one to sort through their personal effects, carefully preserving everything that mattered to Elijah while donating the rest to families in need. She had found love letters between his parents, report cards from his elementary school years, and photographs documenting a marriage built on mutual respect and shared values. These items now filled scrapbooks and memory, boxes that Rosa maintained, like a curator preserving precious artifacts. The door to her small apartment above the garage had been open to other household staff over the years, women, like herself, who worked for wealthy families in the area. They would gather on Thursday evenings, their one consistent night off, to share meals, gossip, and the kind of wisdom that came from observing the intimate dynamics of their employers' lives. "You watch yourself around that one," warned Carmela, who had worked for a prominent family in Richmond for nearly as long as Rosa had been with the Royces. "I've seen girls like her before. They smile pretty, but they got ice in their hearts." "She don't see you as people," added Maria, whose employer had recently married a much younger woman with similar attitudes. "To her, you're just part of the house, like the furniture." And when she decides she wants different furniture, Rosa had listened to their concerns with growing unease, recognizing truth in their observations. Catherine's behavior during her recent visits had become increasingly proprietary, as if she were already mistress of the estate and everyone in it existed solely for her convenience. During Catherine's most recent stay, she had made subtle but unmistakable changes to the household routine. She had rearranged furniture in the main rooms without asking, moved family photographs to less prominent locations, and began referring to various spaces as "we spaces," rather than acknowledging their significance to Elijah's family history. "Rosa will need the master bedroom deep cleaned before next weekend," Catherine had announced, as if Rosa hadn't been maintaining that room to perfection for 40 years. "And we should probably update the linens. These patterns are so dated." The linens in question had been wedding gifts to Grace and Samuel, carefully preserved and used only for special occasions. But Catherine spoke of them as if they were utilitarian items rather than family heirlooms. More troubling were Catherine's attempts to isolate Elijah from Rosa's daily presence. She had begun scheduling activities during Rosa's usual cooking times, suggesting they eat out more often or have meals catered for their visits. She spoke frequently about hiring professional help for special occasions, as if Rosa's decades of experience entertaining dignified guests were somehow inadequate. "I think we should consider getting a real events planner for the engagement party," Catherine had suggested to Elijah during dinner. "Someone who really understands high-end entertaining. Rosa has been planning and executing family celebrations for decades," Elijah had replied carefully. She coordinated my parents' anniversary parties, my graduation celebrations, business dinners for dozens of people. Of course, Catherine had said sweetly. But this is different. We'll have some very important people attending, gallery owners, collectors, society figures. We need someone who understands that level of sophistication. The implication was clear. Rosa, with her working-class background and ethnic sensibilities, could not be trusted to represent Catherine properly to her social circle. These conversations left Elijah caught between two worlds, trying to honor his loyalty to Rosa while navigating Catherine's increasingly unreasonable demands. He found himself making excuses for behavior he would have found unacceptable from anyone else, telling himself that Catherine was just nervous about the wedding, that she needed time to understand the family dynamics, that love would eventually overcome her prejudices. But Rosa could see the toll this internal conflict was taking on him. Elijah, who had always been decisive and confident, now seemed constantly on edge, second-guessing himself and walking on eggshells around Catherine to avoid conflict. The easy warmth that had always existed between Rosa and Elijah was being strained by his awareness that every interaction might become ammunition for Catherine's complaints. "You look tired." "Mijo," Rosa observed one morning as she served him breakfast alone. Catherine had claimed a migraine and was sleeping late. "I'm fine," he said. But the lines around his eyes told a different story. "It's hard when the people we love can't love each other," Rosa said gently, not directly mentioning Catherine, but letting her meaning be clear. "She'll come around," Elijah said, but the conviction in his voice was weaker than it had been weeks earlier. "She just needs time to understand how we do things." Rosa nodded politely. But privately, she wondered if some people were simply incapable of understanding that worth had nothing to do with wealth. The dignity existed independent of social status, that family could be chosen rather than inherited. The breaking point came during Catherine's next visit, when she arrived with detailed plans for updating the estate. She had compiled a folder of interior design magazines, printouts from expensive decorating websites, and business cards from high-end contractors. "I've been thinking about how to modernize this place," she announced, spreading her materials across the dining room table. "Obviously, we'll want to gut the kitchen. It's so outdated. And this wallpaper in the hallway has to go. Very grandmotherly." The wallpaper she dismissed had been chosen by Grace Royce and hung by Samuel himself during their first year of marriage. Rosa had helped maintain it for 4 decades, carefully cleaning and repairing it because she knew how much it meant to the family's history. "We'll want to replace all the fixtures, update the bathrooms, maybe open up some of these smaller rooms to create better flow," Catherine continued, oblivious to the way Elijah's expression was hardening. "And obviously we'll need to reconfigure the staff quarters. That space above the garage could be converted into a proper guest suite." The casual way she spoke about displacing Rosa, about erasing 40 years of family history, about turning a home into a showcase for her own taste, finally pushed Elijah past his breaking point. "Stop," he said quietly. "What?" Catherine looked up from her plans, surprised by the steel in his voice. "Just stop. This isn't a project, Catherine. This is my family's home. These aren't outdated fixtures. They're pieces of my history. And Rosa's quarters aren't being converted into anything. This is her home." Catherine's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, frustration, and finally, cold calculation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new edge. "I'm trying to build something beautiful for us, Elijah, for our future. But you seem more interested in preserving the past than creating something new with me." As Rosa quietly retreated to the kitchen, she opened her Bible that night to a passage she had marked years earlier. "By their fruits ye shall know them." Catherine's fruits were becoming increasingly bitter, and Rosa feared that Elijah's loyalty to her might cost him the future he thought he wanted. The tattered newspaper clipping from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, dated September 15, 1995, had been carefully preserved in Rosa's Bible for nearly 30 years. The headline read, "Young Entrepreneur Transforms Neglected Properties into Community Assets." Below it, A photograph showed a 26-year-old Elijah standing in front of his first major renovation project. A run-down apartment building in Jackson Ward that he had transformed into affordable housing for working families. Rosa had cut out that article with trembling hands, overwhelmed with pride for the young man she had helped raise. She had read it aloud to him over the phone when he was too busy to buy a newspaper himself, her accent making some words difficult, but her joy unmistakable. "The whole neighborhood is talking about you, mijo," she had said. "Mrs. Patterson said you're going to be somebody important one day." Now, as she held that same clipping while preparing for what might be her final confrontation with Catherine, Rosa wondered if success had somehow blinded Elijah to the values that had originally driven his ambitions. The conversation she had dreaded finally came on a crisp October evening. Catherine had arrived at the estate alone, her jaw set with determination and her designer handbag clutched like a weapon. She found Rosa in the kitchen preparing dinner and got straight to the point. "We need to talk," Catherine said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. Rosa dried her hands on her apron and turned to face the younger woman, recognizing the moment they had both been avoiding for months. "I've tried to be patient," Catherine continued, "but this situation has become untenable. Elijah and I are getting married in 6 months, and I need to know that we're going to be able to start our life together without complications." "What kind of complications?" Rosa asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. "You've been wonderful, truly, but this arrangement worked when Elijah was a bachelor. Now he needs to prioritize his marriage and his future. Having you so involved in our daily life is going to create problems." Rosa had expected this moment, but the directness of it still stung. "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to step back. Retire with dignity. Elijah has told me he's been considering setting you up in a nice apartment in town, maybe even helping with your expenses. That seems more than generous for someone in your position." The phrase, "someone in your position," hung in the air like a slap. Rosa felt decades of casual racism and class discrimination wrapped up in those 4 words. The assumption that her life, her contributions, her very presence were somehow less valuable because of who she was and where she came from. "And if I don't step back?" Rosa asked. Catherine's mask slipped completely, revealing the steel underneath. "Then you'll be choosing to damage Elijah's future." "I come from a family with connections, Rosa. Social connections, business connections, political connections. The kind of connections that can make or break a man's career. If Elijah has to choose between advancing in the world that matters and staying stuck in..." She gestured around the kitchen dismissively. "Well, what kind of woman would I be if I didn't help him see clearly?" The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in language designed to make Rosa feel selfish for wanting to remain in the only home she had known for decades. Catherine was essentially saying that Elijah's continued success depended on his ability to conform to the expectations of her social circle, expectations that didn't include embracing a working-class Salvadoran woman as family. "Does Elijah know you're having this conversation with me?" Rosa asked. "Elijah knows that our future together requires certain adjustments," Catherine replied smoothly. "He's a smart man. He understands how the world works." That evening, Rosa made the most difficult decision of her adult life. She found Elijah in his father's study, reviewing contracts by lamplight, and sat down across from him with the formality she reserved for the most serious conversations. "Mijo, I've been thinking about what you said, about helping me find a place in town," she began carefully. Elijah looked up sharply. "Rosa, I told you..." "Please let me finish," she said gently. "I think maybe it's time. You're starting a new life with Catherine, and she should feel comfortable in her own home. I don't want to be the reason for problems between you." The pain in Elijah's eyes was immediate and deep. "You're not the reason for problems, Rosa. You could never be the reason." "But I am causing stress," Rosa continued, her voice steady despite the breaking of her heart. "I can see it in your face every time there's tension. You're trying to make everyone happy, and that's not fair to you. "I don't want you to leave," Elijah said firmly. "This is your home, and it always will be in my heart," Rosa replied. "But maybe it's time for me to let you build something new without worrying about the past." What Rosa didn't tell him was that she had also received visits from two of Catherine's friends, social acquaintances who had made it clear that Rosa's continued presence was being discussed in certain circles as an unusual arrangement that reflected poorly on Catherine's ability to manage her household properly. Word of the conflict had spread through the interconnected networks of Richmond's black professional community as well. Dr. Patricia Williams had called Rosa directly, offering her support and a guest room if she needed to leave the estate temporarily. Marcus Webb had sent his wife to check on Rosa, bringing homemade soup and a gentle reminder that she had allies who would help her no matter what she decided. But it was the conversation with Catherine's mother, Eleanor Mitchell, that had finally convinced Rosa that her position was untenable. Eleanor had arrived unannounced at the estate, sweeping through the front door like a general surveying a battlefield. "I understand there's been some confusion about arrangements here," Eleanor had said, her voice carrying the authority of old money and older prejudices. "Catherine has told me about the situation, and I wanted to clarify a few things." Eleanor had spent 30 minutes explaining, in polite but unmistakable terms, why Rosa's continued presence would be problematic for Catherine's social standing, Elijah's business prospects, and their children's futures. She spoke about appropriate boundaries, professional standards, and the natural evolution of household arrangements when young couples married. "I'm sure you understand," Eleanor had concluded, "that what might have worked for a bachelor's household simply isn't suitable for a married couple of Catherine and Elijah's standing." The message was clear. Rosa was being viewed as an embarrassment, a relic of Elijah's humbler past that needed to be discarded now that he was entering more rarefied social circles. That night, alone in her apartment above the garage, Rosa spread out her most treasured possessions, photographs of Elijah's childhood, copies of his report cards, the newspaper clipping about his first business success, and dozens of other mementos she had collected over the decades. Each item told the story of a boy she had helped raise, a young man she had supported through his struggles, and a successful businessman who had never forgotten where he came from, until now. The next morning, Rosa presented Elijah with a formal letter of resignation, typed on her old typewriter with the careful precision she brought to everything she did. In it, she expressed her gratitude for 40 years of being treated as family, her pride in watching him build his empire, and her desire to step aside so he could embrace his future without being burdened by the past. "This isn't what I want," Elijah said after reading the letter, his voice thick with emotion. "I know, mijo," Rosa replied, "but sometimes what we want and what we need are different things. You need to choose the life that will make you happiest." What neither of them said out loud was that they both knew Catherine had already made the choice for him, and that Rosa was sacrificing herself to preserve the man she had helped shape, even if it meant losing him forever. The discovery came by accident, as the most shocking revelations often do. Elijah was helping Rosa pack her personal belongings from the study, where she had quietly managed various household accounts for decades, when a manila folder slipped from her hands, scattering papers across the Persian rug his parents had bought for their first anniversary. As they both knelt to gather the documents, Elijah's eyes fell on something that made his blood run cold. Credit card statements, bank records and receipts, all in Catherine's name, showing expenditures that exceeded what he knew she could afford on her gallery salary. More troubling still were the notations in Rosa's careful handwriting. Paid C's Visa, $3,247, and covered C's Amex, $5,891, and advanced C's rent, $2,100. "Rosa," Elijah said slowly, holding up one of the statements. "What is this?" Rosa's face went pale as she realized what he had seen. For a moment, she seemed to consider deflecting, but then her shoulders sagged with the weight of a secret she had been carrying for months. "Sit down, mijo," she said quietly. "There are things you need to know." Among the scattered papers was a letter Rosa had written but never sent, addressed to Grace Royce in heaven. The envelope was yellowed with age and worn from handling, as if Rosa had carried it with her through countless moments of doubt and prayer. When Elijah opened it with trembling hands, he found words that would forever change how he understood both women in his life. "My dearest Grace," the letter began in Rosa's careful script. "I write to you because I don't know what else to do. Your son has fallen in love with a woman who I fear will bring him pain, but I cannot find the words to tell him. She has debts she hides from him, spending money she doesn't have on things she doesn't need. I have been paying her bills because I cannot bear to see Elijah hurt by her financial troubles. But I fear I am only enabling her deception." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing a pattern of financial irresponsibility and manipulation that had been growing for months. Catherine had been living far beyond her means, accumulating credit card debt, falling behind on rent for her Manhattan apartment, and financing a lifestyle that required resources she simply didn't possess. "How long?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since about 3 months after you started dating," Rosa admitted. "She called me one day crying, saying she was embarrassed to tell you about some unexpected expenses. She asked if I could help her with rent just once, until her next commission came through. And you did." "I did. Because I thought it would make you happy if she wasn't stressed about money. And because she promised it was just temporary." Rosa's voice carried the weight of someone who had been taken advantage of by someone she had tried to help. But it wasn't temporary. Every month there was something new. Credit cards, car payments, shopping bills. She said her gallery job didn't pay as much as she had expected, that she was struggling to maintain the image her career required. Elijah felt sick as he continued reading through the documents. Rosa had been systematically draining her own modest savings, money she had set aside for her retirement, money she had scrimped and saved from her salary over decades of careful budgeting, to cover Catherine's extravagant lifestyle, designer clothes, expensive dinners, spa treatments, luxury vacations that Catherine had claimed were work-related, all of it funded by a woman who darned her own socks to save money and had never owned anything that wasn't purchased second-hand or on clearance. "Rosa, this is thousands and thousands of dollars," Elijah said, running calculations in his head that made him dizzy. "You've spent your entire savings on her." "Not all of it," Rosa said quietly. "But most of it, yes. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because she begged me not to. She said it would ruin your relationship, that you would think she was with you for your money. She promised she was getting her finances together, that she would pay me back as soon as her career took off." Rosa's voice cracked slightly. "And because I thought maybe if I helped her feel secure, she would learn to be kinder. I thought maybe her cruelty came from fear, but the documents told a different story. Credit card statements showed charges at high-end retailers, expensive restaurants, and luxury hotels, not the expenses of someone struggling to make ends meet, but the purchases of someone who felt entitled to a lifestyle she couldn't afford. There were cash advances, overdraft fees, and late payment, penalties that painted a picture of someone completely out of control. Financially, even worse were the emails Rosa had printed out, correspondence between Catherine and her friends about managing Elijah, about him playing the long game, about ensuring that Rosa was removed from the picture before the wedding so that Catherine could have full access to the resources she deserved. One email, sent to Catherine's friend Vivienne, was particularly damning. "The old woman has been useful for covering my expenses, but she's becoming a liability. Once he and I are married, I'll need to establish clear boundaries about staff overreach. I can't have her thinking she's family when she's really just the help." Another to her mother Eleanor outlined Catherine's strategy. "I've been documenting Rosa's inappropriate boundaries to build a case for her removal. He is sentimental about her, but once he sees how her presence affects our social standing, he'll understand that some sacrifices are necessary for advancement. Elijah felt as if the ground beneath his feet was shifting, as if everything he thought he knew about the woman he planned to marry was crumbling away to reveal someone completely different underneath. Catherine hadn't just been cruel to Rosa, she had been using her, manipulating her generosity and love for Elijah to fund a lifestyle built on lies. She knew, he said, reading through the emails with growing horror. She knew you were using your retirement money to help her and she didn't care. I think she saw it as temporary, Rosa said, though her voice lacked conviction. Maybe she really thought she would pay me back, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Catherine had been systematically taking advantage of Rosa's devotion to Elijah, using it as a personal ATM while simultaneously working to remove Rosa from their lives. The cruelty was breathtaking in its calculation, not just using Rosa's money, but planning to discard her once she was no longer useful. The final piece of evidence was a bank statement showing that Catherine had recently opened a joint savings account with Elijah's name on it, though he had never signed any paperwork or made any deposits. When he called the bank to inquire, he learned that Catherine had forged his signature on the application, using his social security number and financial information to establish the account. She's been planning to steal from you, too, Rosa said when Elijah shared this discovery. Not just taking from me, but positioning herself to access your money directly. The woman Elijah had fallen in love with was revealed to be someone entirely different, not a successful art professional building a career, but a sophisticated con artist who had targeted him for his wealth while using Rosa's love for him as leverage to fund her deception. When Catherine arrived at the estate that evening, expecting to find Rosa gone and Elijah ready to move forward with their wedding plans, she instead found him waiting in the study with all the evidence spread across his father's desk. "We need to talk," he said quietly, gesturing to the papers that documented months of lies and manipulation. Catherine's face went through a series of expressions as she realized what he had discovered. Surprise, panic, and finally, desperate calculation as she tried to determine if the situation could still be salvaged. "Elijah, I can explain," she began, but her voice carried none of its usual confidence. "Explain how you've been stealing from Rosa? Explain how you forged my signature on bank documents? Explain how you've been planning to remove her from our lives after she's funded yours?" Catherine's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold opportunist underneath. "She gave me that money willingly," she said defensively. "I never held a gun to her head. You manipulated a woman who loves me into bankrupting herself to support your lies. I was trying to build something with you," Catherine protested. "Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain the kind of image necessary for advancement in my field? I was investing in our future by stealing from my family." "She's not your family," Catherine snapped, her true feelings finally emerging. "She's an employee who has overstepped her boundaries for decades, and you've been too sentimental to see it. I was trying to solve a problem that was going to damage both of our careers." As Elijah listened to Catherine's justifications, her complete lack of remorse, her anger at being caught rather than shame for her actions, her continued dismissal of Rosa as unworthy of consideration, he realized that the woman he thought he loved had never existed at all. Elijah's mother's engagement ring sat in its velvet box on his bedside table, no longer a symbol of promise, but evidence of betrayal. The modest diamond that Grace Royce had worn with such pride for 37 years now seemed to mock him from its setting, reminding him of how far he had strayed from the values his parents had instilled in him. Catherine had accepted this ring with tears and promises, but now he understood that her emotion had been calculation. Her tears perhaps rehearsed for the occasion. In the 3 days since discovering Catherine's deception, Elijah had moved through the motions of his daily life, while his mind worked furiously to process the magnitude of what he had learned. The woman he had planned to marry was not just cruel or classist. She was a predator who had systematically targeted him while using Rosa's love as a weapon against them both. Rosa had tried to leave the estate quietly, packing her belongings in the early morning hours when she thought Elijah was still sleeping. He had found her in the kitchen at dawn, surrounded by boxes and bags, moving with the deliberate care of someone trying not to wake the household. "Where are you going?" he had asked, though he already knew the answer. "Mrs. Patterson has a room for me," Rosa had replied, referring to an elderly neighbor who had been Grace's friend. "Just until I can find a proper apartment. I don't want to make things more difficult for you." "You're not making anything difficult," Elijah had said firmly. "Catherine is the one who created this mess, not you." But Rosa's resolve had been unshakable. "Mijo, I've seen enough family drama in my life to know how these things go. The longer I stay, the harder it will be for you to do what you need to do. And what you need to do is clear." She was right, of course. Elijah had spent the weekend reviewing bank records, consulting with his lawyer about the forged documents, and most importantly, examining his own conscience about what kind of man he wanted to be. The answer had become increasingly clear with each passing hour. The engagement party was scheduled for the following Saturday, an elaborate affair Catherine had planned at the country club, with over 200 guests expected to attend. Invitations had been sent, deposits paid, and announcements submitted to the society pages. Catherine's friends and family had already begun arriving from New York and Connecticut, turning what should have been a celebration into an elaborate stage for what Elijah now recognized as performance art. But before that public reckoning, he knew he needed to have private conversations with the people whose opinions mattered most to him. Dr. Patricia Williams had been the first person he called, asking her to meet him for coffee downtown, rather than discussing such sensitive matters over the phone. When he laid out the evidence of Catherine's financial manipulation and emotional abuse, Patricia's response had been immediate and uncompromising. "That child showed you who she was from the very beginning," Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been navigating social dynamics and class prejudices for 7 decades. "The question now is whether you're going to believe what you've seen or continue making excuses for behavior you would never tolerate from anyone else." "The engagement party is in 6 days," Elijah had said. 200 people are expecting. 200 people will survive being disappointed," Patricia interrupted. "Rosa might not survive another year of being treated like a disposable convenience by someone who should be grateful for her love." Marcus Webb's reaction had been even more direct. When Elijah showed him the financial documents and email correspondence, Marcus had whistled low and shaken his head. "Brother, this woman didn't just play you, she played a master-level game, using Rosa's love for you to fund her lifestyle while planning to discard her. That's sociopathic behavior. You can't marry someone like that and expect to sleep peacefully for the rest of your life." "But the social complications," Elijah had started. "What social complications?" Marcus had demanded. "You're worried about embarrassing some people who think Rosa is beneath them. Those aren't your people, Elijah. Your people are the ones who've been telling you for months that something was wrong." The community response had been swift and decisive once word began to spread about Catherine's behavior. Elijah hadn't intended to discuss the situation publicly, but Rosa's network of friends and supporters had quickly pieced together what had happened when she suddenly moved out of the estate. Carmela and Maria, Rosa's Thursday evening companions, had organized a fund to help Rosa recover some of her lost savings. Dr. Williams had quietly spread word through professional networks, ensuring that Catherine's manipulation would be known to the people whose opinions mattered in Richmond's black professional community. Even more surprising had been the response from some of Catherine's own social circle. Vivian, one of Catherine's closest friends, had called Elijah directly after hearing rumors about the cancelled engagement. "I need you to know that not all of us approved of how Catherine was handling things," Vivian had said carefully. "Some of us tried to tell her that her attitude toward Rosa was inappropriate, but she wouldn't listen. She seemed to think that marrying you gave her the right to remake your entire life according to her." preferences, the conversation had revealed that Catherine's behavior had been noticed and criticized even by people within her own social stratum, that her treatment of Rosa had been seen as gauche and cruel rather than sophisticated or appropriate, but Catherine herself had not been passive during this time. Recognizing that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling, she had launched a desperate campaign to salvage the situation. Phone calls to Elijah became increasingly frequent and manipulative, alternating between tearful apologies and veiled threats about social consequences. "Everyone makes mistakes with money. Darling," she had said during one particularly calculated conversation, "I was embarrassed about my financial struggles, and I made some poor decisions. But we can work through this together. Couples overcome much worse than a few credit card bills." When emotional manipulation failed, Catherine had escalated to involving her family. Eleanor Mitchell had called Elijah personally, her voice carrying the frosty authority of old money and older prejudices. "I understand there's been some misunderstanding about household finances," Eleanor had said. "Catherine has explained that this Rosa person convinced her to accept some inappropriate gifts, and now there's confusion about repayment. Surely this can be resolved without derailing a marriage that represents such a wonderful joining of families." The conversation had revealed the depth of Catherine's lies. She had told her family that Rosa had been the manipulator, that the financial arrangement had been Rosa's idea, and that the current conflict was the result of Rosa's attempts to cause problems between them. "Catherine is a lovely girl from a good family," Eleanor had continued. "She's made some errors in judgment, but she's young and learning. Surely you don't want to throw away a future with her over the hurt feelings of household staff." These conversations had only strengthened Elijah's resolve. The casual dismissal of Rosa's humanity, the assumption that financial manipulation was merely a misunderstanding, and the complete lack of accountability for Catherine's actions had shown him how deep the rot went in Catherine's family system. On Thursday evening, 2 days before the scheduled engagement party, Elijah made his final decision. He had spent hours alone in his father's study, surrounded by the evidence of Catherine's deception and the mementos of his family's values. The pocket watch, Rosa's Bible, photographs of his parents, and the newspaper clipping of his first business success all seemed to bear witness to the choice he needed to make. The man his parents had raised, the values Rosa had reinforced through decades of selfless service, the principles that had built his business empire, all of it pointed toward the same conclusion. Character mattered more than convenience. Loyalty meant more than social advancement. Love required respect, and respect could not be purchased or manipulated into existence. That evening, he called Catherine and asked her to meet him at the estate the following night. When she asked about the purpose of the meeting, he had been deliberately vague. "We need to discuss our future," he had said simply. "I'm so glad you called," Catherine had replied, relief evident in her voice. "I knew you'd realize that we can work through this silly misunderstanding. I've already spoken to my family's lawyer about the best way to handle the financial arrangements, and I think you'll be pleased with what we've worked out." As Elijah hung up the phone, he realized that Catherine still believed she could manipulate her way out of the consequences of her actions. She still thought this was a problem that could be solved with the right words, the right connections, the right pressure applied to the right people. Tomorrow night, she would discover how wrong she had been. The engagement ring sat in its box like an accusation, waiting to be returned to someone who had never deserved to wear it. And somewhere in town, Rosa was living in a borrowed room, having sacrificed everything for a family that she still believed was worth protecting, even from herself. The family portrait above the fireplace in the main sitting room seemed to watch over the estate like a benediction. Grace and Samuel Royce's painted eyes, holding the same warmth and dignity that had defined their lives. Rosa had carefully maintained the oil painting for decades, dusting the ornate frame weekly and ensuring that the soft lighting in the room never faded the rich colors. Tonight, as Elijah waited for Catherine's arrival, his parents' faces seemed to offer silent encouragement for what he was about to do. Catherine arrived precisely at 7, as if punctuality could somehow demonstrate her commitment to salvaging their relationship. She wore a white dress, perhaps deliberately, chosen to suggest innocence and new beginnings, and carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who believed she could still control the outcome of this. "A conversation, darling," she said, moving to kiss his cheek as if nothing had changed between them. "I'm so glad we're finally going to put this misunderstanding behind us." Elijah stepped back from her attempt at affection, gesturing instead toward the 2 chairs positioned across from each other near the fireplace. The engagement ring box sat on the coffee table between them, its presence immediately noted by Catherine despite her attempts to maintain casual conversation. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened," Elijah began, his voice steady but distant. "About Rosa, about the money, about the lies. I know I made mistakes," Catherine said quickly, leaning forward with practiced contrition. "I should have been honest about my financial situation from the beginning. I was embarrassed, and I handled things poorly. But we can fix this, Elijah. My family's lawyer has already drawn up a repayment plan for Rosa." "Stop," Elijah said quietly. "Just stop." Catherine's expression flickered with confusion, as if she couldn't understand why her usual approach wasn't working. "This isn't about repayment plans or legal documents," Elijah continued. "This is about who you are as a person. And who you've shown me you are is someone I cannot marry." "You're overreacting," Catherine said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Yes, I made some poor financial decisions, and yes, I could have been more diplomatic with Rosa. But you're talking about ending our engagement over what amounts to a personality conflict with hired help." "Hired help," Elijah repeated the phrase slowly. "After everything I've told you about Rosa, after 40 years of her devotion to my family, you still see her as hired help. What else would you call her?" Catherine's mask was beginning to slip, revealing the contempt she had been hiding for months. "I mean, let's be realistic here, Elijah. You pay her to maintain your house and cook your meals. The fact that you've developed an emotional attachment to her doesn't change the fundamental nature of the relationship." Elijah felt something cold and final settle in his chest as he realized that Catherine truly couldn't understand what Rosa meant to his family. "Rosa helped raise me," he said carefully. "She was there for every important moment of my childhood. She held our family together when my parents died. She sacrificed her own financial security to protect me from your lies. And I'm grateful for her service," Catherine replied with practiced magnanimity. "And that's why I'm willing to make sure she's compensated fairly for the money she lent me. But Elijah, we can't build a marriage on the foundation of outdated sentiment. You have responsibilities now, to me, to our future children, to the position we'll hold in society." "What position is that?" "The position of successful, sophisticated people who understand how the world works," Catherine said, her frustration becoming more apparent. "Look around you, Elijah. You've built an empire. You belong in rooms with governors and senators and business leaders. Do you really think any of those people maintain the kind of inappropriate relationship with their household staff that you've allowed here?" The casual racism in her words, the assumption that successful black people should distance themselves from other black people of lower economic status, the suggestion that love and loyalty were somehow inappropriate when they crossed class lines, revealed everything Elijah needed to know about Catherine's true beliefs. "Rosa isn't my household staff," he said firmly. "She's my family. And the fact that you can't see the difference tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Catherine stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. "Fine. You want to know who I am? I'm someone who understands that success requires choices. I'm someone who knows that you can't drag every person from your past into your future without consequences. I'm someone who was trying to help you see that Rosa's presence in our lives would have been a constant source of embarrassment and limitation." "Embarrassment to whom?" "To everyone who matters," Catherine snapped. "Do you think my friends didn't notice her last weekend? Do you think the partners at your law firm don't talk about your unusual household arrangements? Do you think potential business partners won't wonder about your judgment if you can't maintain appropriate boundaries with service personnel? Elijah stood as well, moving to position himself directly in front of his parents' portrait. Their painted faces seemed to strengthen his resolve, reminding him of the values they had lived by and died believing in. "The only person whose judgment I'm worried about right now is my own," he said quietly. "And my judgment tells me that anyone who would ask me to choose between them and Rosa has already lost." Catherine stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her calculating whether there was any argument, any manipulation, any leverage she hadn't yet tried. When she spoke again, her voice carried a venom he had never heard before. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," she said coldly. "I could have given you everything: social connections, cultural sophistication, the kind of life that matches your success. Instead, you're choosing to limit yourself because you can't let go of some sentimental attachment to a woman who should have been put in her place years ago." "Her place?" Elijah asked quietly. "Yes, her place. Which is not at the center of your personal life, interfering with your romantic relationships and making demands on your loyalty that she has no right to make." Catherine's voice rose with frustration and anger. "She's a maid, Elijah. A maid who has manipulated your guilt and sentiment to create a position for herself that is completely inappropriate and unsustainable." The cruelty in her words, the complete dismissal of Rosa's humanity and worth, finally pushed Elijah past any possibility of reconciliation. "Get out," he said quietly. "What?" "Get out of my house. Get out of my life. And never speak about Rosa that way again." Catherine's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, and finally, cold calculation. She picked up her purse and moved toward the door, but stopped to deliver one final attack. "You'll regret this," she said. "When you're sitting alone in this museum of mediocrity, when no woman of quality will have you because of your attachment to the help, when your business suffers because people question your judgment, you'll remember that I offered you something better." After she left, Elijah sat alone in the sitting room for a long time, looking up at his parents' portrait and feeling their approval wash over him like a blessing. He had chosen family over convenience, love over social advancement, character over comfort. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. Catherine's retaliation came swiftly and with the precision of someone accustomed to wielding social influence as a weapon. By Monday morning, barely 36 hours after their confrontation, rumors were already circulating through Richmond's social circles about Elijah's irrational behavior and concerning judgment issues. The story, as Catherine told it, painted Elijah as a man unable to maintain proper boundaries with household staff, someone whose business success had been undermined by inappropriate emotional attachments. Eleanor Mitchell had made strategic phone calls to key figures in the social hierarchy, expressing concern about Elijah's mental state and suggesting that the broken engagement was the result of his inability to distinguish between professional relationships and personal ones. Catherine herself had returned to New York, but continued her campaign through carefully placed conversations and social media posts that hinted at disturbing revelations about her ex-fiancé's character. The country club, where their engagement party had been scheduled, became ground zero for whispered conversations about whether Elijah's success had made him forget his place in society. Some of the older members, particularly those who had never been entirely comfortable with the idea of a black man achieving such prominence in their circles, seized on the gossip as confirmation of their existing prejudices. But Catherine had miscalculated the depth and breadth of Elijah's community support. The response to her attacks came from unexpected quarters, revealing networks of loyalty and respect that she had never bothered to understand. Dr. Patricia Williams was among the first to respond publicly, writing a letter to the Richmond Times-Dispatch that praised Elijah's character and integrity while subtly demolishing Catherine's credibility. Without mentioning specific details, Patricia's letter made it clear that the broken engagement was the result of Catherine's failure to appreciate the values that had made Elijah successful, not any weakness on his part. Marcus Webb organized a more direct response, reaching out to business partners, clients, and professional colleagues to ensure they heard the truth before Catherine's version could take hold. The reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. Elijah's reputation for integrity and fair dealing had been built over decades, and most people who knew him professionally found Catherine's implications absurd. More importantly, Rosa's network of friends and supporters had rallied around both her and Elijah with a force that surprised everyone involved. The Thursday evening group of household workers had become an informal communication network, spreading word throughout the domestic worker community about Catherine's manipulation and cruelty. Their employers, many of whom were prominent Richmond families, began to understand the situation from a perspective that Catherine hadn't anticipated. That young woman tried to destroy someone who has given 40 years of faithful service to one family. Carmela had told her employer, a prominent lawyer's wife. She stole that poor woman's retirement money and then tried to throw her away like garbage. No decent person would do such a thing. The story spread through interconnected social networks with remarkable speed, and the narrative that emerged was very different from the one Catherine had tried to construct. Instead of Elijah being seen as a man with poor judgment, he was increasingly viewed as someone who had been deceived by a manipulative opportunist, but had shown integrity by choosing loyalty over convenience. Rosa herself had initially tried to remain out of the public eye, staying at Mrs. Patterson's house and avoiding any discussion of the situation. But when Elijah appeared at her temporary residence on Tuesday evening, carrying a new key to the estate and a formal letter from his lawyer, she could no longer hide from the resolution she had never expected. "I want you to come home," Elijah said simply, holding out the key that he had specially made, not just a copy of the old key, but a new one engraved with her initials, symbolizing her rightful place as family rather than employee. "I want you to come home and stay home for as long as you want to be there." The letter from his lawyer formalized what Elijah had been planning for years, a legal document granting Rosa lifetime tenancy rights to the apartment above the garage and a monthly stipend that would ensure her financial security, regardless of his own circumstances. More than that, it included language that recognized her as a beneficiary of the estate, ensuring that she would always have a home and an income, even if something happened to him. "Mijo, you don't have to do this," Rosa said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she read the document. "You don't owe me anything." "I'm not doing this because I owe you," Elijah replied. "I'm doing this because you're family, and family takes care of each other." When Rosa returned to the estate that evening, she found that Elijah had spent the day making changes that symbolized a new chapter in their relationship. Catherine's belongings, which had been gradually accumulating in various rooms, had been packed and shipped back to New York. The photos Catherine had moved or hidden had been restored to their original positions. The recipe book was back in its place of honor in the kitchen, and fresh flowers from the garden filled every room. Most importantly, Elijah had commissioned a small addition to the family portrait in the sitting room, a painted extension that included Rosa standing beside his parents, her hand resting on young Elijah's shoulder in a pose that captured her role as the third pillar of his upbringing. "I should have done this years ago," Elijah said as they stood together looking at the modified portrait. "You've been part of this family since I was a child. It was wrong of me to let anyone make you feel otherwise." The following week, Elijah issued a public statement through his company's communications office. The brief announcement simply said that his engagement to Catherine Mitchell had been terminated by mutual agreement, and that he looked forward to continuing to build his business and serve his community with the support of his family, including Rosa Martinez, who had been part of his life for over 4 decades. The statement was carefully worded to avoid any direct accusations or details about Catherine's behavior, but its emphasis on family values and long-time relationships made the underlying message clear to anyone paying attention. Catherine made one final attempt at retaliation, threatening legal action over the broken engagement and claiming financial damages for wedding expenses and social embarrassment. But when Elijah's lawyer presented evidence of her forged bank documents and financial manipulation, the threats quickly evaporated. Catherine's family, faced with the possibility of criminal charges and public exposure of their daughter's behavior, quietly encouraged her to accept the situation and move on. By the end of the month, Catherine had relocated to California, citing new opportunities in the Los Angeles art market. The truth was simpler. Her reputation in East Coast social circles had been irreparably damaged by the exposure of her manipulation and cruelty. As Rosa settled back into her routines at the estate, both she and Elijah felt the profound relief that comes from surviving a crisis with integrity intact. The new key she carried was more than just a symbol. It was a promise that her place in the family was secure, that her sacrifices had been recognized, and that love had triumphed over manipulation. For the first time in months, the estate felt like home again. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the Royce estate as Rosa hummed softly while preparing breakfast, her movements carrying the contentment of someone who had found her way home after a long journey. On the refrigerator, held by a simple magnet, was a new family photograph, Elijah and Rosa standing together in the garden, their arms around each other's shoulders, their faces reflecting the peace that comes from weathering storms together and emerging stronger. The photograph had been taken the previous month, during Rosa's 64th birthday celebration, an event that had drawn friends and family from across Virginia to honor a woman whose quiet strength had touched countless lives. Dr. Patricia Williams had been there, along with Marcus Webb and his family, Mrs. Patterson and her extended network of friends, and dozens of other people who had come to understand that Rosa represented something precious and increasingly rare, unconditional love expressed through decades of faithful service. Elijah had given a speech that evening that brought tears to many eyes, speaking about the difference between people who enter your life and people who become part of your story. Rosa didn't just work for my family, he had said. She became my family, and then she helped me understand what family really means. The months following Catherine's departure had been a period of healing and growth for both Rosa and Elijah. Without the constant tension and underlying conflict that Catherine's presence had created, the estate had settled back into the rhythms of peace and mutual respect that had characterized it for decades. But more than just returning to the old ways, they had discovered new depths in their relationship. As equals rather than employer and employee, Rosa had embraced her enhanced role as family matriarch and trusted advisor with the same grace she brought to everything else. Elijah had begun consulting with her on business decisions, recognizing that her decades of observing human nature and managing household finances had given her insights that proved invaluable in his professional dealings. She had helped him identify which business partners could be trusted and which social connections were worth cultivating, her judgment proving remarkably astute. People show you who they are in small moments, Rosa had told him during one of their evening conversations on the front porch. How they treat someone who can't help them, how they speak when they think no one important is listening, how they handle other people's trust. If you pay attention to those things, you'll never be surprised by their big actions. The wisdom that came from her own experience with Catherine had made Rosa an even more valuable confidant. She had learned to recognize manipulation and entitlement early, and her protective instincts toward Elijah had sharpened rather than diminished. After their ordeal, when Elijah had started receiving invitations to social events again, including interest from several women who admired his integrity, in handling the Catherine situation, Rosa had become his informal advisor on matters of the heart. There's a difference between someone who wants to be part of your life and someone who wants to use your life, she had observed after meeting Dr. Angela Morrison, a pediatrician who had begun attending some of the same charity events as Elijah. That one, she looks at you like she sees you, not like she sees what you can do for her. Dr. Morrison had indeed proven to be different from Catherine in every meaningful way. She treated Rosa with immediate warmth and respect, asking about her garden, her cooking, and her thoughts on various topics with genuine interest rather than polite condescension. When Elijah had mentioned that Rosa had helped raise him, Angela had smiled and said, "Then I need to make sure she approves of me, don't I?" The contrast with Catherine's attitude couldn't have been more stark, and both Rosa and Elijah had recognized it immediately. As summer turned to fall, the estate had taken on new life under their shared stewardship. Rosa's garden had never been more beautiful. Her cooking had reached new heights of creativity and flavor, and the house itself seemed to radiate the contentment that comes from being properly loved. Elijah had commissioned several improvements to Rosa's apartment, adding a sunroom where she could read and tend plants during the winter months, and updating the kitchen with modern appliances that made her work easier and more enjoyable. The legal documents that formalized Rosa's place in the family had been finalized, giving her not just security but dignity. She was no longer someone who worked for the Royce family. She was a member of the Royce family, with all the rights and protections that status entailed. The broader community had taken notice of Elijah's transformation as well. His business had not suffered from his choice to prioritize family loyalty over social advancement. If anything, it had strengthened as clients and partners recognized his integrity and moral courage. The story of how he had defended Rosa against Catherine's manipulation had become a quietly told tale of character prevailing over convenience, earning him respect from quarters he hadn't expected. During a recent interview with a business magazine about his company's continued growth, Elijah had been asked about the keys to his success. His answer had surprised the interviewer, but would have made Rosa proud. "Success isn't just about building wealth or accumulating status," he had said. "It's about becoming the kind of person who deserves the trust that others place in you. My family taught me that, and I'm grateful I never forgot the lesson." On this particular morning, as Rosa finished preparing breakfast and Elijah came downstairs to join her in the kitchen that had become the heart of their home, both of them felt the deep satisfaction that comes from having chosen correctly when the choice was difficult. "What's on your schedule today, mijo?" Rosa asked, as she had asked thousands of mornings before. "Lunch with Angela, then a meeting with the contractors about the community center project," Elijah replied, pouring himself coffee from the pot Rosa always had ready for him. "What about you?" "Mrs. Patterson is coming over to help me plan the Christmas menu. She wants to learn how to make my tamales for her grandchildren." Rosa smiled as she spoke, enjoying the prospect of sharing her knowledge with another grandmother who understood the importance of feeding family with love. As they sat together at the kitchen table, sharing breakfast and conversation as they had done for decades, the new family photograph on the refrigerator caught the morning light. In it, Rosa and Elijah stood together, not as employer and employee, not as benefactor and dependent, but as what they had always truly been, family members who had chosen each other and been willing to fight for that choice when it mattered most. Some betrayals cut deeper than others, but some bonds proved stronger than any attempt to break them. In choosing Rosa over Catherine, Elijah had chosen love over convenience, integrity over advancement, and authenticity over performance. The choice had cost him a fiancée, but it had earned him something far more valuable: the peace that comes from knowing you have remained true to the people and principles that matter most. As Rosa often said during their evening conversations, "Love isn't just a feeling, mijo. It's a choice you make every day, in big moments and small ones. And the people who love you will make that choice even when it's difficult. looking at their reflection in the kitchen window as they shared another morning together. Elijah knew that he had learned to make that choice correctly, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt truly at home.